know this guy from the Midas Touch Network. He is great takes, great. He tries to be objective in his treatment of a lot of subject matter that's very hard to be subjective about. How about it for the great Anthony Davis? He's my favorite Britisher.
Hello, Mark. Yeah. Great to see you.
All right, so you mentioned Gaza, by way of the Israeli army, and I want to touch on that. I also want to get into the House of Representatives, the Santos thing a little bit, and just what's happening with American government. And we got up on, you can see the 5-minute news and the Midas Touch work that you do. Anthony covers a lot of this. There were no good moves, I suggest. I'll postulate this, and you can tell me what you think. Once Hamas attacked in the way they did and produced the atrocities that they did, the deliberate atrocities, horrifying, reminiscent of the Holocaust, all of these various aspects of the atrocities that were pretty much, I want to say in recent history, unprecedented. Certainly no attack of this kind in the history of the state of Israel since the Yom Kippur War. There were, I would say, very few good options for the Israelis. And now we've seen, with their decision to go into Gaza, which was, again, predictable. I think this is completely Hamas predicting exactly what was going to happen. I don't think Hamas is surprised by this, and I'm going to shut up in a second and let you speak. But all I'm trying to say is that the circumstance that the Israelis found themselves in against that backdrop left them so few options. And now I'd suggest you lose, of course, any moral high ground. That was going to happen right away. And the international community support begins to melt away, and even support in this country begins to melt away. You end up in a very tough position. And this is not to even mention the humanitarian horror that's going on in Gaza. Now, you please.
I have a new theory, and a lot of it centers around Benjamin Netanyahu, who, of course, is is really at the center of the decision to go to war. And I think if he was genuinely taken off guard and the intelligence didn't make its way to him, or he chose to ignore it, because, of course, the Egyptians and the Americans tipped him off in advance that there was going to be some kind of attack. Why he dropped the ball, I don't know, and I'm not a conspiracist. But I do think that when you have an ego like Netanyahu, because he's a populist and, has certain Trump-like qualities and is very much on the right, the far right, maybe the reaction, and I was thinking, if it was Trump, let's say Trump was the president of Israel, and this happened on his watch and he missed it, what would his reaction be? Because obviously we know Trump better than we know Netanyahu. And I was thinking that these kind of egomaniacs, they would be embarrassed, and the only way to deal with that would be to counterpunch in a much more significant way. In the case of Netanyahu, go to war, an all-out war. Because the attack was a terrorist attack. It wasn't an act of war. It was a terrorist attack that felt like an act of war if you were on the beach in Israel, or if you were on the receiving end of it. Of course, it feels like war in the same way that for us 9/11 felt like the start of the war, because we didn't know where it was headed. The first plane, well, that's random. Second plane, an act of war. And so you feel the need to retaliate. And in the same way that Bush retaliated but chose Iraq as the wrong country to pick on. And I was thinking, I'm just trying to get into the head of Netanyahu. If he did or he didn't get the tip off, he is going to overreact, and he's probably wanted to for years. Right? He's probably needed and wanted an excuse to decimate Gaza for years. Because as much as they say, we're trying to avoid civilian casualties, they don't care for Palestinians. They just don't. And, I'm not on anybody's side. I'm on the side of peace, and I'm on the side of no war, and on the side of a ceasefire. And I respect the Israelis, and I respect the state of Israel, but I also respect the fact that the Palestinians need somewhere to live. So I'm down for a two-state solution. But Netanyahu isn't, and is the Israeli government aren't, and the Israeli army aren't, and they just won't say it. And so anybody who claims to be seeking some kind of ceasefire, they say, you're on the side of Hamas. And it's like, no, of course not. I'm not taking the side of a terrorist organization. But you can't go bombing the hell out of a refugee camp. You know.
So this is what I was speaking about when. That's an interesting notion that Netanyahu's wanted this. The reason I might push back on that is that I think I wouldn't dispute your underpinning presumption that Netanyahu doesn't want the Palestinians there, and the Palestinians are a pain in his ass, and he's aggressively led settlers into the West Bank, et cetera. I mean, clearly,
and he's being investigated for corruption,
right?
And he's trying to shut down the judiciary. Do his own version of that.
There's a political expedience to this. Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot going on in the Netanyahu camp that needs to be dealt with.
I think that's very good to be mentioned in all of this. You're right. Yeah. It's sick to think of it, but there's a political formula to all of this carnage also. But it's so easily a region-wide conflict. I just don't think that helps Netanyahu particularly. But he may have miscalculated. I mean, you may be right, and he just miscalculated. And you're also right that he's a bad dude, man. He's not the guy for this moment, clearly.
And you have to take mental health into a lot of these debates, as I think about a lot. I don't think about anything that Donald Trump does without considering his mental pathology, because he's different to people that are not as unwell as he is. He is unwell. And often people who have governed for decades, and let's be honest, Netanyahu has managed to keep getting himself reelected for years now. I mean, I remember him when I was a kid. I remember seeing him on a bus coming to London on a tour, and I was like, oh my God, there goes Benjamin Netanyahu. And I was like, what was I? I was like 19. Right. This guy has been around for 20 years, like Putin, 22 years. Trump says he wanted to be president forever. The narcissistic aspect of this is that these people want to remain in power. Once they get a taste for it, they want to keep it. And I don't pretend to know enough about Israeli politics, but I do know that we're dealing with people who are not the full ticket, and you can't second guess how they might behave. And the fact that they are so anti anything other than, I mean, they said they didn't even have a plan for Gaza after this war.
Right.
They admitted that the other day.
And this is the key. I mean, it's the Powell doctrine played out in Gaza. You break it, you buy it. You now, and this is why I say even in this moment, the Israelis have so few options, and none of them are good. You can occupy Gaza, right, after that's the only way you're really going to get rid of Hamas, is to occupy Gaza. That's the way you can root it out. You talk about rooting it out, hunting them down. You're not going to be doing that with, I think, these, select incursions, special forces, bombing. It's just not going to be enough. Hamas is a sophisticated network now. They're not what they were 10 years ago. They've developed these tunnels. The video, it's funny, Anthony, the video shows these kind of narrow tunnels. The tunnels that Hamas has, they're like the London tube system. They're immense, This isn't some crude Vietnamese tunnel of the sort that that we're used to terrorist organizations having cobbled together.
Right.
So you don't want to occupy Gaza if you're Israel, right?
Well, you would have thought that. Look, I don't believe that civilized democratic nations should start wars. Right? I just don't think that should be in their jurisdiction. I think that to be involved in international communities like the United Nations, to do, sanctions and diplomacy, like that's how these nations should behave. Now, Russia invading Ukraine, Russia is not a civilized nation. It has a despot leader. Well, what do we expect? And they did it with Crimea before. The war was already going on. But I still think back to post 9/11 and to Bush going into Iraq and then Afghanistan, and look at that now. Afghanistan's now in the hands of the Taliban.
Yeah, after 20 years of American presence there.
And the cost, the cost in terms of lives and military equipment, plenty of people got rich out of it. But there was no exit plan. And this is something that has been the biggest criticism of Iraq and Afghanistan was like no exit plan. So knowing that, why would you start a war? Because I think you can clearly hear that what I'm saying here is I believe that the attack on Israel was a terrorist attack, and what Netanyahu's done is declare war on Hamas and the Palestinian people effectively.
Yeah, I would push back a bit on that framing, but it's not way off. I would just suggest to you that the scale of the attack was such that, it didn't feel like a one-off terror attack. It was far bigger, and because it wasn't from a nation state, you're in a much tougher. This is the tough part of the punchback. You must do something. You can't. You're charged with the security of your people, right? As a leader. Now, again, it's provocative to say, hey, look, they had this intelligence. They either ignored it, or they slept on it, they were distracted, or it was deliberately ignored so they could punch back. But whatever, as you punch back, you pretty much only have one option: to go after Hamas, don't you? Yeah. They're the ones who have hostages. They're the ones who perpetrated the attack to begin with.
And if you care for the people, you do something first to allow the people to leave, which they didn't do. And then when they said, you've got 24 hours to go, well, you can't evacuate 1 million people in 24 hours through these, because, let's be honest, Israel has barricaded Gaza. Right, it is. They control
Israel
everything.
And the Egyptians, to be fair.
Yeah, but they control the water supply and the energy, and
right.
all of the essential services. And so, I just feel like the aggressive nature of the retaliation. Someone said to me, here's a thought. Someone wrote to me yesterday when I was posting about this, and they said, "Do you honestly think that Israel would start a war with Hamas in Gaza without permission from the Americans?" What do you think about that?
I think they absolutely would. I don't think they asked permission from the Americans. I think I also think that the hand plays itself a little bit. Of course, they're the allies, the democracy in the region. They're our strongest ally in the region, although, back channel alliance with the Saudis, et cetera. I mean, you can, that's a much more intriguing conversation than it probably seems on the surface. But anyway, I don't know. It's fair to say that they may have said, look, we are going to do this. But I don't think they asked, can we do this?
Because
Would you accept that?
The problem with this is that the rhetoric that's being put out there is that this had Biden's support. And, this attack and this war is going to negatively affect Joe Biden at the ballot box.
Absolutely right.
Because, you assume that because Israel is an ally and the U.S. is an ally of Israel and vice versa, that these decisions were taken mutually. And so, therefore, people who want to, diss Biden are going to give the impression that he sanctioned this. And now he's having to backtrack and say, we want to deal with the humanitarian aspect of this, and that he's talking about protecting Palestinian civilians. Israel are not talking about that. It's not something that they are focused on or interested in, unfortunately. And so there is going to be a separation, I think, of the thinking of Israel, Netanyahu, and the thinking of Biden, because there's an election coming up here in the U.S. Everything has a knock-on effect. And so Biden's having to play a very careful game. Not everybody is fully aligned with Israel as the Constitution might suggest they should. This is the problem. Because the West helped create the State of Israel, there is a natural allegiance. But when Israel retaliates in such a way and seems not to give much concern for the humanitarian aspect of this, you do question your allegiance.
I was trying to find you also I think that's a really great point about allegiances changing and political winds changing allegiances and dictating allegiances. The Haredi Jews, exempt from Israel's military service mandate, are now signing up to fight. During wartime, we must all do the maximum. Anyone who isn't studying Torah full-time should contribute. This is an interesting, and this is when I talk about the Middle East, I really feel most people are talking out of their ass one way or the other.
Well,
you know what I mean?
We all are.
Yeah.
The example I give is about territory, right? The reason that we couldn't win in Iraq or Afghanistan is because it's territory. If you are the invading force, it's not your home. But if you are, an Afghani or even an Afghani working for the Taliban, because the Taliban paid more money than the U.S. government did, or than the Afghan government paid, right? So people need to put food on the table, so they're going to go and work for the highest bidder. The Taliban are paying double. So, the allegiance is about, people are dug in. If they're born there, if they live there, if it's their home, then they're going to fight to the death. Whereas, the occupying force, it doesn't have that same emotional and cultural relationship with the landscape.
Well, the other thing about land is a point I made, I think, last week, which is that, war is really only good for acquiring land. I mean, you can't... through war, get people to, jump on the same economic policies that you have or religious philosophies that you have. It just doesn't, you can't bomb people into that kind of conformity. You can take land, and that's really what these military incursions are about. But again, so the Israelis want Gaza? No, they don't. They pulled out in 2005.
They don't like the Arabs. I mean, it's just as simple as that.
Right.
It's like we often talk about the fact that religion and land are really the things that divide us. The tribalism, and this is what it is. And there's still confusion. People don't really understand. Israel is obviously the state of Israel is a home for the Jews, but there's just as many Christians living there. There are Christians who see Israel as the Holy Land too, and so an Israeli is not always a Jew. So it's very confusing. And then of course when you get into the Arab world, you're talking about the Sunnis and the Shiites and the separation in the religions. It's like there is a lot to learn, and I think us white people in the West really could make a lot more effort with our homework.
I think it's worth saying, and it's also nuanced. I mean, the reality is that there are people. I mean, just to make a point, because I don't want to. I think we shouldn't get blowback on this, because recognizing that there was a big move among the Israelis to reach out to the Arab community, to reach out to the Palestinian community. My God, many of those people who were slaughtered were peaceniks. They were really committed to some kind of relationship with the Palestinians that doesn't exist now. To a two-state solution at minimum, I mean, the other thing I wanted to, and this is kind of, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to share something with you that a lot of the anti-Semitism that is cropping up worldwide is frightening. It's chilling. I mean, European Jews are feeling as they did pre-World War II. Yeah. It's awful, man. I mean, what's happening in France, I read the numbers here on the show yesterday. What's happening in France, Germany, across Europe, and it's happening all over the world. But listen to this. The Qataris, wildly wealthy, and it's where Hamas hangs out, right?
Yeah. And they're doing the negotiations now at the moment.
Thank you, exactly, for the hostages. Senior leaders of Hamas, the perpetrators of the worst atrocity against Jews since the Holocaust, are huddled in Qatar. They've been there for years. But American foreign policy has turned a blind eye to this. Why? One reason might be that for the last 25 years, this small, energy-rich state has pumped billions into America to purchase influence and good favor. The Qataris have spent their lavish fortune at American law firms, on lobbying contracts with former senior officials, and on junkets and partnerships with big media companies. The biggest recipients of Qatari largesse have been major universities and think tanks. The numbers are staggering. In 2022, from the National Association of Scholars, Qatar today is the largest foreign donor to American universities. I mean, Anthony, I was blown away by this. I didn't know this.
Well, they've bought up half of London, and I knew that living in London. I was like, oh, there's another Qatari building being built. It's like this. They are very strategic about buying into Western nations and being part of the culture.
And buying into the thinking and the thinkers of tomorrow. Since 1997, they've donated more than $103 million to the Virginia Commonwealth University for a fine arts campus. Since 2001, they donated $1.8 billion to Cornell for a medical school.
Yeah.
Since '03, they've donated $700 million to Texas A&M for an engineering campus. I mean, I could go on. I've got a whole list of. I didn't know this stuff, so I started researching. It's crazy, and so those are the minds of tomorrow. So I think the Middle East, and I think you said it just a moment ago so well, it's a confusing place, and unless you're there, these allegiances, it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and
But
you
also,
have to
when people are poor, they will do anything, to keep put food on the table. And this is something that I think we have to remember, is that a lot of the people there now, as a result of the bombing, I mean, it was a busy place until a week or so ago. The infrastructure is completely knocked out. Let's just say one thing about the anti-Semitism before we finish, which is that I personally feel that racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia are everywhere and have always been everywhere. The countries where you have less of it are the countries where people were still racist and xenophobic and anti-Semitic, but they're a little more educated. They're a little more, they understand the importance of integration and tolerance, and they're more respectful. And I think that, there's that song in Avenue Q, everyone's a little bit racist. And, and I think that there is some truth to that. But it depends on how you've grown up and who you grew up with and what kind of environment you grew up with. And, my American friends who grew up in the Midwest or places where they didn't see a black or a gay person until they traveled across the country. It's like you can't help where you're born, and you can't help that kind of hereditary learning. And so we all have to make a lot more effort to understand the nuances of faith and of skin pigmentation, and just understand a little bit more about it before we start judging people, because fundamentally we are all the same. Prick us and we shall bleed, tickle us and we shall laugh.
Sure. I mean, I think that says it so well. I think you can be born into one of these theocracies and realize that's not the way for me. I mean, it does happen. People fall away from that indoctrination. But sometimes it takes a while, and I think the plurality of some societies isn't reflected worldwide. But it's a scary time. Love spending time with you. I encourage everybody to check out the 5 Minute News, and also your show. I love the show you do once a week also now on Midas.
The Uncovered Show.
The Uncovered Show. I enjoy that too. Yeah.
No, there's a lot. There's just so much. I mean, this is the thing, we could always talk for hours. I would just finally say that, I really believe that this is Benjamin Netanyahu's war, I really feel like this is a lot of this is about him. And I think as time goes on, we're gonna, because obviously they're going to investigate as to why they didn't know or why they didn't act and everything. I think a lot of this is going to go back to this guy trying to save himself.
Yeah, you started in a provocative way to say, look, this is the war he wanted. I mean, he wanted it all along. So that's a very provocative react. If I get emails and other stuff, I'll share them with you next time. Maybe you'll come back and visit with us. I hope soon, maybe next week or whatever. But I love our time together. So thanks a lot, Anthony Davis.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped. And please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.